The Complete History of the Egyptian Pyramids. A calm journey through 4,500 years of mystery. Part 1. The Dream in the Desert. Thousands of years ago, long before the Great Pyramids stood above the Egyptian desert, the land beside the Nile was already home to a remarkable civilization. During the day, the desert was bright and almost endless. At night, it became quiet beneath a sky filled with stars. And through this ancient landscape flowed the Nile River. The river was the heart of Egypt. Without it, the surrounding land would have been almost impossible to farm. Every year, the Nile flooded its banks, leaving behind rich, dark soil. Farmers planted wheat and barley. Villages appeared along the river. And slowly, people began to build a permanent way of life. But as Egyptian society became more organized, something else began to change. The Egyptians developed a powerful belief about death. They believed that death was not the end. A person's existence continued in another world. And the king, or pharaoh, had an especially important journey after death. His body had to be protected. His memory had to survive. And his journey to the next world had to be prepared. At first, Egyptian burials were simple. People were placed in ordinary graves. Later, important people were buried in rectangular structures known as mastabas. These early tombs were very different from the enormous pyramids that would come later. But they were the beginning. The Egyptians were learning how to build. They were learning how to organize workers. They were learning how to cut and move stone. And eventually, one man would transform these ideas into something completely new. His name was Imhotep. He lived during the reign of Pharaoh Dosa. And his vision would change Egyptian architecture forever. Part 2. The First Pyramid. Pharaoh Dosa belonged to Egypt's third dynasty. When his great tomb was planned, the Egyptians were still using the traditional mastaba form. But Imhotep had a different idea. Instead of building one level, why not build another level above it? And another above that? The structure slowly began to rise. Layer after layer of stone was added, until a remarkable shape appeared above the desert. The Step Pyramid of Dosa. It was not the smooth-sided pyramid that we usually imagine today. Instead, it looked like a series of enormous steps reaching toward the sky. But it represented something revolutionary. For perhaps the first time, Egyptians had created a massive monument almost entirely from carefully shaped stone. The Step Pyramid became the beginning of a great experiment. Egyptian architects would continue to learn. They would make mistakes. They would change their designs. And they would slowly move toward the perfect pyramid. But the journey would not be simple. Part 3. Why were the pyramids built? To understand the pyramids, we need to understand the ancient Egyptian view of death. The Egyptians believed that a person had several spiritual aspects. Death did not simply mean disappearing. Instead, it was a transition. The dead could continue to exist in another world. But the body was important. This was one reason the Egyptians developed elaborate methods of preserving the dead. The body of an important person could be carefully prepared and protected. Food and objects could be placed in the tomb. Prayers and religious texts could accompany the dead. And for the pharaoh, the tomb became part of a much larger religious journey. The pyramid was therefore much more than a giant pile of stones. It was connected to the pharaoh's burial and his passage into the afterlife. The enormous size of these monuments also reflected the power of the Egyptian state. Building a pyramid required workers, food, tools, transportation, planning, and enormous organization. It showed that the kingdom could bring together thousands of people for a single purpose. The pyramid was a tomb, but it was also a symbol of kingship, a symbol of religion, and a symbol of a civilization's ability to organize itself on an extraordinary scale. The experiments before Giza. After the step pyramid, Egyptian builders continued experimenting. They wanted taller monuments. They wanted smoother sides. They wanted to transform the stepped structure into something that seemed to rise directly toward the sky. At Dasha, an unusual pyramid was constructed. Today we call it the bent pyramid. Its lower section rises at a steep angle. But higher up, the angle changes. The result is a strange and fascinating shape. The bent pyramid revealed that Egyptian builders were still learning. But they did not stop. Another pyramid was built nearby. It became known as the Red Pyramid because of the reddish color of its stone. This pyramid had smooth sides. It was a major achievement. The Egyptians had moved much closer to the form that would later become famous at Giza. They had learned from their mistakes. They had improved their engineering. And now, the greatest experiment was about to begin. The next great destination would be the plateau of Giza. The road to Giza. Near the Nile Valley was a broad limestone plateau. Giza. Thousands of years ago, it looked very different from the modern landscape. There were no roads filled with tourists. No modern buildings. No engines. Only desert, stone, and the river nearby. And here, Egyptian builders would create 3 enormous pyramids. The largest would belong to Pharaoh Khufu. The second would be associated with Khafra. And the third would be built for Menkaure. But the Great Pyramid of Khufu would become the greatest of them all. Imagine standing there during construction. The desert would be filled with activity. Stone workers would be cutting limestone. Others would be transporting blocks. People would be preparing food. Boats would be moving along the Nile. Supervisors would be organizing the work. And slowly, year after year, the pyramid would rise higher and higher until it dominated the landscape. Where did the stones come from? One of the greatest questions surrounding the pyramids is simple. Where did all those stones come from? Much of the limestone used in the core of the Great Pyramid came from nearby quarries. Workers separated blocks from the natural rock. They shaped them using stone and copper tools. Then the enormous blocks had to be transported. The Egyptians did not have modern machines. There were no trucks, no cranes powered by engines, no steel cables. Instead, they used human organization and relatively simple technologies. Wooden sledges were likely used to move heavy stones. Ropes helped workers pull them. Water could make sand easier to travel across in certain conditions. And the Nile provided a natural highway. Boats could transport heavy materials from distant locations toward the pyramid complex. The process must have been incredibly demanding. But the Egyptians had one advantage that modern observers sometimes underestimate. They had time. And they had organization. The construction of a monument like the Great Pyramid was not a project of weeks or months. It was a project of years, perhaps decades. How was the pyramid built? Once the stones arrived, another problem appeared. How could enormous blocks be lifted higher and higher? This is one of the questions that still has no single universally accepted answer. Researchers have proposed several possibilities. Ramps may have been used. Some theories suggest straight ramps. Others propose systems that changed direction as the pyramid grew. There have also been ideas involving internal or partially enclosed ramps. The exact construction method remains uncertain. But one thing is clear. The Egyptians were extremely capable builders. They could measure. They could align structures. They could organize large workforces. They could transport enormous quantities of stone. And they could repeat the same process thousands of times. Slowly, the pyramid grew. The lower levels became buried beneath higher ones. The structure became steeper. The workers continued upward. And finally, the enormous monument approached its final height. The desert below looked smaller. The Nile became a distant ribbon. And the pyramid seemed to reach toward the heavens. For a long time, people imagined the pyramids being built by vast armies of slaves. But archaeological evidence has given us a more complicated picture. Near Giza, archaeologists discovered evidence of organized settlements connected with the workers. There were areas for food preparation. There were workshops. There were storage facilities. There were also workers' graves. The evidence suggests that large organized teams worked on the construction. Some were skilled craftsmen. Others were laborious. Some transported stone. Others prepared food. Some made tools. Some organized supplies. The pyramid was therefore not simply a monument built by a few people. It was a massive national project. The Egyptian state had to feed the workers. It had to provide tools. It had to transport materials. It had to organize schedules. And it had to maintain order. The Great Pyramid was therefore not only an engineering achievement. It was also an achievement of administration. Thousands of individual tasks had to become one enormous project. The Great Pyramid of Khufu. Eventually, the Great Pyramid became the largest structure in the landscape. It was built for Pharaoh Khufu. For thousands of years, it remained the tallest human-made structure on Earth. Its core was made from enormous quantities of limestone. Its outer surface was once covered with smooth casing stones. When the sunlight touched those polished stones, the pyramid must have appeared very different from the rough structure we see today. It may have seemed almost brilliant beneath the Egyptian sun. Inside the pyramid were corridors and chambers. There was a descending passage. There was a grand gallery. And there was the king's chamber. A granite sarcophagus was found inside. But Khufu's mummy was never discovered there. Was the burial disturbed long ago? Was the body removed? Was the pyramid robbed in antiquity? We simply do not know. And that uncertainty is part of what makes the Great Pyramid so fascinating. The pyramids were not alone. Nearby stood another extraordinary monument, the Great Sphinx. It has the body of a lion and a human head. It faces toward the horizon. For thousands of years, it has watched over the desert. The Sphinx is generally associated by researchers with the reign of Pharaoh Khafra. But many questions remain. Why was it created? What exactly did it represent? How was it carved from the bedrock? Over the centuries, sand repeatedly covered the monument. At times, only its head could be seen. Later, workers cleared away the sand. And once again, the giant figure emerged. Today, the Sphinx remains one of the most recognizable symbols of ancient Egypt. But perhaps its greatest mystery is not what we know. It is what we still do not know. The three Great Pyramids. Standing together on the Giza Plateau are three Great Pyramids. The largest is the Pyramid of Khufu. Beside it stands the pyramid associated with Khafra. And the smallest of the three major pyramids belongs to Menkaure. They were not isolated monuments. Around them were temples, causeways, smaller tombs, and other structures connected with royal funerary ceremonies. Giza was more than a collection of pyramids. It was a vast royal cemetery. A carefully planned landscape of death and remembrance. The pyramids dominated the horizon. But around them, everyday human activity continued. Workers lived nearby. Food was prepared. Tools were repaired. Boats moved along the river. People were born. People grew old. And people died. While the great stone monuments stood above them. The desert is quiet. The wind moves across the sand. The pyramids rise in the darkness behind you. And the great stone face looks toward the horizon. The Sphinx has survived thousands of years. Kingdoms have risen and fallen around it. Languages have changed. Religions have changed. Foreign armies have entered Egypt. And yet the Sphinx remained. Its nose was damaged long ago. Its body has suffered from erosion. Sand repeatedly covered it. But the monument survived. It became a symbol of endurance. A reminder that the ancient Egyptians were thinking about time on a scale much larger than a single human lifetime. The pharaoh might die. The kingdom might change. But the monument was meant to remain. The hidden spaces. The pyramids continue to surprise modern researchers. Today, scientists can study ancient monuments without destroying them. Using modern scanning technologies, researchers have detected previously unknown spaces inside the Great Pyramid. These discoveries remind us that the pyramid is still not completely understood. There may be hidden passages. There may be structural spaces. There may be chambers whose purpose remains uncertain. But it is important to separate evidence from speculation. Not every mysterious space is a secret tomb. Not every unusual feature has a supernatural explanation. Sometimes the answer is simply engineering. Sometimes we do not yet know. And that is perhaps the most honest answer. The Great Pyramid has survived for more than 4,000 years. Yet even now, it continues to give us new questions. The end of the Pyramid Age. But eventually, the great age of pyramid building came to an end. Egyptian kings continued to build monuments. But enormous pyramids were no longer the dominant form of royal burial. Over time, royal tombs became smaller and more hidden. Later kings were buried in places such as the Valley of the Kings. There was a practical reason for this change. Large, obvious tombs could attract thieves. A hidden tomb offered better protection. Egyptian civilization itself also changed. New dynasties rose. Old dynasties disappeared. Foreign powers eventually entered Egypt. Persians ruled. Later, Greek rulers arrived. And eventually, Egypt became part of the Roman world. The pharaohs were gone. But their pyramids remained. The mystery that never ended. Thousands of years have passed since the Great Pyramids were built. The people who constructed them are gone. The kings they served are gone. The ancient kingdoms have disappeared. But the pyramids remain. They have watched the sun rise over the desert for thousands of years. They have watched the Nile continue its journey toward the Mediterranean. They have survived wars, empires, earthquakes, sandstorms, and the passing of countless generations. Today, we can explain many things about them. We understand much about Egyptian religion. We understand their burial traditions. We know that organized workers built the monuments. We know where much of the stone came from. We understand many of the engineering principles they used. But some questions remain. Exactly how was every stone lifted? What happened to Khufu's mummy? What secrets remain inside the Great Pyramid? What was every chamber designed to accomplish? And perhaps most importantly, what did the Egyptians hope future generations would feel when they looked upon these enormous monuments? Maybe the answer was simple. They wanted to defeat time. They wanted the names of their kings to survive. They wanted their dead rulers to continue their journey into eternity. And somehow, they succeeded. Because thousands of years later, we are still standing beneath the same desert sky, looking toward the same ancient stones, and wondering about the people who built them. The pyramids remain silent, but their silence tells a story. A story about the Nile, about kings, about death, about faith, about engineering, and above all, about human ambition. The ancient Egyptians could not stop time, but they built something that could travel through it. And perhaps that is the greatest mystery of all. The pyramids were built by people who knew they would one day disappear. Yet they built for eternity. And after more than 4,000 years, they are still here. Still standing. Still watching. The mystery that never ended. Thousands of years have passed since the Great Pyramids were built. The people who constructed them are gone. The kings they served are gone. The ancient kingdoms have disappeared, but the pyramids remain. They have watched the sun rise over the desert for thousands of years. They have watched the Nile continue its journey toward the Mediterranean. They have survived wars, empires, earthquakes, sandstorms, and the passing of countless generations. Today, we can explain many things about them. We understand much about Egyptian religion. We understand their burial traditions. We know that organized workers built the monuments. We know where much of the stone came from. We understand many of the engineering principles they used. But some questions remain. Exactly how was every stone lifted? What happened to Khufu's mummy? What secrets remain inside the Great Pyramid? What was every chamber designed to accomplish? And perhaps most importantly, what did the Egyptians hope future generations would feel when they looked upon these enormous monuments? Maybe the answer was simple. They wanted to defeat time. They wanted the names of their kings to survive. They wanted their dead rulers to continue their journey into eternity. And somehow, they succeeded. Because thousands of years later, we are still standing beneath the same desert sky, looking toward the same ancient stones, and wondering about the people who built them. The pyramids remain silent, but their silence tells a story. A story about the Nile, about kings, about death, about faith, about engineering, and above all, about human ambition. The ancient Egyptians could not stop time, but they built something that could travel through it. And perhaps that is the greatest mystery of all. The pyramids were built by people who knew they would one day disappear. Yet they built for eternity. And after more than 4,000 years, they are still here. Still standing. Still watching. Part 4: The Mystery of Death and the Afterlife. A calm journey through ancient Egyptian beliefs. Long ago, beside the quiet waters of the Nile, the people of ancient Egypt lived with an unusual understanding of death. To them, death was not simply an ending. It was a doorway, a passage from one existence into another. When the sun disappeared beyond the western horizon each evening, the Egyptians watched it sink into darkness. But they believed the sun would return. Morning always followed night. And in this endless cycle of darkness and light, they saw a reflection of human existence. Perhaps death was like sunset. And perhaps the soul, like the sun, would one day rise again. This belief would influence almost every part of ancient Egyptian civilization. It would shape their tombs, their temples, their prayers, their funerary objects, their mummies, and eventually, the enormous pyramids that would rise from the desert. The journey beyond death. To understand the Egyptians, we need to step back thousands of years. Imagine a small Egyptian village beside the Nile. The sun is beginning to set. The fields are quiet. A farmer has returned home after working beside the river. His family is preparing food. Children are resting. And above the horizon, the sky is turning gold. For this family, death was not an unfamiliar subject. Everyone eventually faced it. But the Egyptians did not see the dead as simply disappearing. They believed that a person's existence could continue after the body stopped living. The journey after death was complicated. It involved spiritual forces, divine beings, judgment and transformation. And most importantly, the dead person needed to be prepared. The body and the soul. Ancient Egyptian ideas about the soul were complex. They did not necessarily think of a person as having only one invisible spirit. Instead, they described several aspects of existence. Among the most important were the Ka and the Ba. The Ka was connected with a person's life force. The Ba was often represented as a human-headed bird and was associated with an individual's personality and ability to move between different realms. There was also the concept of the Ark, associated with a transformed and effective spirit in the afterlife. These ideas changed over thousands of years and were not exactly the same in every period. But one basic belief remained powerful. The person's existence could continue beyond physical death. And because of this, the body mattered. Why preserve the body? If the soul could continue after death, why did the body need to be preserved? The ancient Egyptians believed that the different aspects of a person needed to remain connected. The physical body was therefore important to the deceased person's continued existence. If the body completely disappeared, the journey into the afterlife could become more difficult. This was one reason Egyptians developed the practice of mummification. But mummification did not appear suddenly in its later, highly developed form. It evolved slowly. In the earliest periods, people were sometimes buried directly in the dry desert sand. The natural heat and dryness could preserve bodies surprisingly well. The Egyptians eventually learned from these natural effects. They began developing increasingly sophisticated methods of preserving the dead. And over generations, mummification became an art. The house of the dead. When an important person died, the preparation of the body could take many days. The body was treated carefully. Certain internal organs were removed and preserved. The body was dried using a natural salt mixture known as natron. Then it was wrapped carefully in layers of linen. Amulets could be plaque. Among the wrappings, prayers and magical texts could accompany the dead. The purpose was not simply to make the body look peaceful. The purpose was to prepare the deceased for another existence. The mummy became a bridge between the world of the living and the world of the dead. And that belief would eventually lead to one of the most fascinating traditions in ancient Egypt: the preparation of entire burial chambers as miniature worlds. A tomb was more than a grave. Imagine entering an ancient Egyptian tomb. The walls are covered with paintings. There are images of food, boats, fields, animals, people, and scenes of daily life. Why would Egyptians place pictures of ordinary life inside a tomb? Because they believed these images could help provide the deceased with what they needed in the afterlife. A picture of food could symbolize nourishment. A picture of a boat could represent transportation. A picture of fields could represent a peaceful existence. The tomb was not simply a place where a body was hidden. It was a carefully prepared environment for eternity. And the more important the person, the more elaborate the tomb could become. The kingdom beyond the horizon. The Egyptians imagined the afterlife in several ways. One important concept was the realm associated with Osiris, the god of the dead and regeneration. Osiris himself was believed to have died and been restored, becoming a powerful symbol of resurrection and renewal. The deceased hoped to join him. But getting there was not necessarily easy. The dead would face judgment. And this brings us to one of the most famous scenes in Egyptian religion. The weighing of the heart. The weighing of the heart. Imagine standing in a great hall beyond the world of the living. The deceased stands before divine beings. Nearby is a balance. On one side is the person's heart. On the other side is a feather associated with Marat. Marat represented truth, justice, balance and proper order. The heart represented the person's moral life. Had the person lived according to the principles of Marat? Had they committed wrongs? Had they lived with honesty and justice? The heart was judged. If the heart was found worthy, the deceased could continue toward a blessed existence. But if it was judged unworthy, the consequences were terrifying. A creature known as a mit, often depicted with features of a crocodile, lion, and hippopotamus, was believed to devour the unworthy heart. This was not simply a story about punishment. It expressed a central Egyptian idea. The universe needed balance. Life needed order. And a person's actions mattered. Osiris, Lord of the Dead. At the center of many Egyptian beliefs about the afterlife stood Osiris. Osiris was associated with death, resurrection, and the world of the dead. According to Egyptian mythology, Osiris was killed by his brother Seth. His wife, Isis, searched for him and helped restore his body. Osiris eventually became ruler of the dead. His story carried a powerful message. Death could be followed by renewal. Just as plants emerged from the earth after the Nile's annual flooding, life could emerge after death. The cycle of nature became connected with the cycle of existence. And this connection between death and renewal became one of the deepest themes in Egyptian civilization. The sun's journey. There was another important idea. Every evening, the sun disappeared in the west. To the Egyptians, this was more than an ordinary sunset. The sun god Ra was believed to travel through the underworld during the night. He faced dangers in darkness. And then, each morning, he emerged again. The sunrise became a symbol of renewal. Night did not last forever. Darkness did not have the final word. And so, the daily journey of the sun became a powerful metaphor for human death and rebirth. Perhaps this is one reason the Egyptians placed such importance on the western side of the Nile for many burial grounds. The sun set in the west, and the dead began their journey there. The first mummies. Long before the famous royal mummies were created, nature itself had already demonstrated a simple method of preservation. The dry Egyptian desert could naturally preserve bodies. Early Egyptians sometimes buried their dead in shallow graves. The hot sand removed moisture from the body. The result could be surprisingly well preserved. Over time, however, people began using more elaborate burial practices. As Egyptian beliefs became more sophisticated, so did their methods of preservation. The body was no longer simply buried. It was prepared, protected, wrapped, and placed inside increasingly elaborate coffins. Eventually, the Egyptians would become famous throughout the ancient world for their skill in mummification. The journey needed supplies. But there was another question. If the dead were going to continue living in another world, what would they need? The answer, according to Egyptian beliefs, was almost everything. Food, water, clothing, furniture, tools, jewelry, and sometimes even models representing servants. These objects were placed inside tombs. Wealthy people could afford elaborate burial goods. Kings could command enormous resources. This explains why some royal tombs contained extraordinary treasures. But it also created a serious problem. The more valuable the tomb, the more attractive it became to thieves. The fear of tomb robbers. Ancient Egyptians understood that their tombs could be attacked. Grave robbers existed even in antiquity. They searched for gold, jewelry, precious stones, and other valuable objects. This created a conflict. The Egyptians wanted their tombs to be powerful and impressive. But the more visible and valuable a tomb became, the greater the risk of robbery. This problem would eventually influence Egyptian burial architecture. At first, kings built enormous monuments that could be seen from great distances. Later, royal burials increasingly moved into hidden locations. And eventually, the Valley of the Kings would become one of the most important royal burial grounds in Egypt. But that transformation came much later. Before that, there was another great idea. A structure that would combine royal power, religion, and the journey into the afterlife. The pyramid. Death and the birth of the pyramid. The pyramid was not created simply because Egyptian kings wanted enormous monuments. Its roots were much deeper. The pyramid developed from earlier traditions of royal burial. The Egyptians wanted to protect the dead king. They wanted to preserve his body. They wanted to provide him with everything necessary for the afterlife. And they wanted his memory to survive. The rising shape of the pyramid may also have carried religious meaning. It pointed upward toward the heavens. It was connected with the sun and the idea of rebirth. The dead king was not simply placed underground. He was symbolically connected with the eternal cosmos. And this helps us understand why the pyramids became so enormous. They were built for eternity, a civilization obsessed with time. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about ancient Egypt was its relationship with time. The Nile flooded. The water receded. Seeds were planted. Crops grew. The harvest arrived. Then the cycle began again. The sun rose. The sun set. The stars moved across the sky. The seasons changed. Everything seemed to follow a rhythm. The Egyptians saw death in the same way. Life, death, renewal. The end was not necessarily an ending. It was another stage in a larger cycle. And this belief gave their civilization a unique attitude toward death. They did not ignore it. They prepared for it. They built for it. They wrote about it. They painted it on their tomb walls. And they preserved the bodies of their dead. The quiet tomb. Imagine now that thousands of years have passed. The person who once lived inside the tomb is gone. Their family is gone. Their friends are gone. Their kingdom may even be gone. But the tomb remains. The paintings remain. The stone remains. And sometimes, incredibly, the mummy remains. The silence inside the tomb becomes almost timeless. No voices. No footsteps. Only the memory of a civilization that believed death was a journey. A journey that required preparation. A journey toward another world. The road ahead. The ancient Egyptians spent thousands of years refining their ideas about death. Their beliefs changed. Their gods changed. Their burial traditions changed. Their tombs changed. But the central idea remained remarkably powerful. Death was not the end. It was a journey. And the dead needed a body. They needed protection. They needed offerings. They needed prayers. And they needed to be prepared for the world beyond life. That belief would lead to some of the greatest monuments ever constructed. It would lead to the pyramids. It would lead to elaborate tombs. It would lead to the art of mummification. And it would leave behind mysteries that still fascinate us today. But before the Egyptians could perfect the art of preserving their dead, they first had to discover exactly how to preserve the human body, how to remove moisture, how to protect the skin, how to wrap the body, how to preserve the organs, and how to turn a human body into something that could survive thousands of years. That is where our next journey begins. The story of the Egyptian mummy. A story of science, religion, death, and the ancient Egyptian dream of eternal life.